Have you ever been assigned something to read, and you sat there and you stared at it, and you said all the words in your head, but when it was all done, you really didn't understand what it was saying? It's happened to everybody. This video, entitled How to Get More Out of What You Read, should give you some useful tools. It's me, Moser, and after this video, you should be able to use the process of annotation to understand, summarize, and hopefully intelligently discuss a text. That text might be a magazine article, something from a book, or even something you read on a website. Let's get started. To start, you're going to need 4 things. First are a set of annotation guidelines. If you're my student, you will be using these, Moser's Guidelines for Annotating Science Texts. If you're not my student, you're welcome to steal these, or your teacher may have something themselves that they want you to use. You'll need a text, of course. We've got an article we're going to use here as an example. You will need access to a dictionary, and that could be an online dictionary or it could be a paper dictionary. It might be a specialized science dictionary, and it might just be a plain old English language dictionary. You're also going to need either an interactive whiteboard app like this, Doceri, or Explain Everything, or whatever your favorite one is, or a bunch of Post-it notes, some notebook paper, and a stack of highlighters. You ready? I want to look over these guidelines for annotating science texts with you. You'll notice that it's a stepwise progression. We have step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And step 1 is just pre-reading. You're going to look at the text, the article, the website, the excerpt from a book, and you're going to scan through it. You're going to attempt to read it. You should use the title here. You should use any illustrations or images here. You're forming a rough idea in your mind of what this thing is about. Now, if this is a science text, there may be some words in there that you don't know. But you can't just skip them because those words can change the meaning of the text. So, as you skim through it, you're going to look for words you don't know, and you're going to circle them. Those are your vocabulary words that you will be looking up. We'll talk a little bit more about the methodology in a second. Once you've looked up all those vocabulary words and jotted down some definitions, you're going to reread the paragraphs, now that you know what those words mean, and try to get the main idea from each one. Once you've found a sentence that closely relates to the main idea, you're going to underline it or highlight it. There might not be a single sentence that states the main idea. Sometimes there will be a sentence that comes close or that really hints at the main idea. Then, off to the side, you'll summarize each chunk. That might be a paragraph or 2 or 3 paragraphs at once, but it's a short piece of the text. You're going to summarize the big picture, what this is saying. Then you're going to reread yet again, looking for connections, things that strike you. Either, the text says this here, and that's an awful lot like what they're saying here, or there's a text-to-self connection. We don't have a lot of those in science, but, it might be something that it reminds you of from real life. There are text-to-another things, connections, which might connect to a movie or something we talked about in class. And finally, and you won't have a whole lot of these to start, text-to-research connections. So maybe we've talked about a piece of research or you've summarized a piece of research, and now you're seeing something that reminds you of that. The last step in this process, step 6, is summarizing the whole darn thing. You're going to look back, reread, look over the vocabulary, look at the summaries for each chunk, and the main ideas and summaries for each chunk, and put together a paragraph or so that sums up what the article says. Now, we're going to walk through one together. I've got an article here that I pulled off a website called Science Daily, and I literally pulled it up on my iPad, took a screenshot of the top of the article and midway through the article and a little further down the article. So I have a series of images that give me the whole article. If you're doing this all electronically, this is probably what you'll want to do. If you have a paper copy of your article or you're working from a book, you're going to handle this a little bit differently. So I've got my images for the article, but they're really distracting. I've got all these ads and banners and things all over them. So I'm going to clean them up a little bit in my photo editor. Since they're just images, I can open the photos on my iPad, hit edit, and I can crop that image down until it looks a lot neater. Something like this. Yeah, that's better. Now, because I'm still going to have multiple screens for this, I've divided it up into 2-3 paragraph chunks, and I'm going to black out that bottom because I'm only going to look at these 3 paragraphs on this slide. I'm going to start with that pre-reading, and I'm going to look at the title to start with, How Microbes Generate and Use Their Energy to Grow. Now, because I'm your biology teacher, I know all the words in that sentence, but you might not. You might not know exactly what the word microbe means, and you might not be sure what the word generate means. When you're not sure about what a word means, even if you think you can probably get it correct from context, you should probably circle it for a lookup. I'm going to circle a few words here that I think a lot of students at the upper, middle, or early high school level might have a problem with. Now, I am going to give you some little helpful hints here. As I read the little summary that this article gives me, researchers have shed light on how bacteria and baker's yeast generate and use their energy to grow. Knowing about cells' energy use is essential for industrial biotech processes. Well, if I wasn't sure about microbes, but I thought it might mean little things, that right there gives me a pretty good clue. Now, I'm still going to go ahead and I'm going to look it up. To do that, I'm going to go to an online dictionary. My favorite is actually Merriam-Webster, but you can also use good old dictionary.com. As you get into more specialized science language, you may have to find a science dictionary, but we should be able to handle everything in this particular article using one of our standard dictionaries. If you're doing this on paper, you can still use an electronic dictionary, or you can use a paper copy. When I looked up microbe in dictionary.com, I got a microorganism, especially a pathogenic bacterium. Ooh. When I looked it up in Merriam-Webster, I got a microorganism, a germ. Now, in some cases, you'll need to scroll down in the dictionary because there may be more information as we go. And you'll notice on Merriam-Webster, they give you these little down arrows. Other words from microbe, did you know, and example sentences. Those can be helpful if you're still struggling to figure out what the word means. Based on those 2 definitions, plus my nice little context clue right there, I'm going to go ahead and over here on the side, I'm going to jot down the definition for microbe. So I've jotted down microbe, microscopic thing, bacteria, yeast, etc. It's really important to understand that definition well enough that you can put it in something that resembles your own words. It makes a lot more sense to you if you do. Now, having done that, I can reread that sentence. Why microscopic things like bacteria and yeast generate and use their energy to grow. Oh, I forgot to look up generate. Okay. So my 2 dictionaries for generate gave me to bring into existence, to procreate or beget, to originate by a vital chemical or physical process, to be the cause of, or to define or originate something. That's Merriam-Webster. Dictionary.com gets me to bring into existence, to cause to be, to produce, to create and distribute, to reproduce, or to produce by a chemical process. Okay. Looking at those 2, and I don't think I have to scroll down any, I think I kind of get this. To make something. To generate, to make, or produce. So now I'm going to look at that sentence one more time. How tiny little things like bacteria and yeast make and use their energy to grow. Hey, I understand what that means. Cool. Doesn't have to be fancy language. It has to be language that you can understand. Now, a quick note, if you were doing this on paper with a paper article, these little red squares that I'm making over here and writing my definitions in, those would be your post-it notes. Or if you've got a paper article that's got wide enough margins, you might just make those little notes in the margins. Well, can I just write them all down on a separate piece of paper? No, you can't. The whole point is that you have those definitions right next to the text you were trying to understand. That's super important. You have to have the text and your annotations together. It doesn't work any other way. Now I'm going to repeat that process for the whole article, going in anywhere from 1 to 3 paragraph chunks. The more complicated the text is, the smaller you want your chunks to be. So how many chunks do I get out of this article? Well, I have these 3 paragraphs, which when I read through it seemed to go together. I have these 2 paragraphs, which I felt went together. These 3 paragraphs. And these, I guess they're 4 paragraphs, though some of them, even though they're set apart, are really just a single sentence. So it's kind of almost like one paragraph split up a couple ways. This is the last paragraph of the article, and I included it partly so that you can see that every Science Daily article is going to have a source listed, and it's going to have a journal reference. This is the scientific magazine that this research was originally published in. Okay, let's start. Okay, so I do know most of these words, but I've decided to go ahead and highlight some words that I think might be unfamiliar to you, or that you haven't regularly heard used in writing or in speech. So, microbial. Well, on our last slide, we looked up microbe, and they're little tiny things. When we look up microbial, interestingly enough, the dictionary actually shifts us back to the definition for microbe. If we scroll down a little farther, we find that they say it's an adjective. So a microbial factory is a factory made of microbes. Oh, a microbial cell factory. It's a factory made of microbe cells. Okay. So a little factory of, which microbes were we talking about? Oh yeah, bacteria and baker's yeast. So this is a cell factory made up of the cells of bacteria and of baker's yeast. Knowing how microbial cell factories consume energy and how proteins are allocated to do so is crucial when working with industrial fermentations. Proteins. Is that like the stuff that I eat in my hamburger or eggs? I don't know. I better look that up. Allocated. What does allocated mean? Crucial. I've heard that word before. Okay, let's look them all up. Okay, I'll start with protein on dictionary.com. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Protein. Definition 1, biochemistry. Any number of numerous, highly varied organic molecules constituting a large portion of the mass of... Blah! Did you just shut down? I would if I wasn't familiar with biology. Oh boy. Any of numerous highly varied organic molecules. Let's look at definition 2. Plant or animal tissue rich in such molecules, considered as a food source. Oh, that would be the protein in my hamburger or my fried eggs. Let's look at the other dictionary's definition real quick. Okay, Merriam-Webster's actually looks a little simpler. Any of the various naturally occurring, extremely complex, well, I know complex means complicated, substances, that's just stuff, that consist of amino acid residues joined by peptide bonds, contain the elements, blah, 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 blah. Well, what do I really get out of that? Okay, so protein is a naturally occurring thing, and it's complicated. Okay, let me try this. Okay, protein, a complicated chemical found in natural things. Well, wait a minute. We're talking about cell factories from little microbes, so let me try that. Furthermore, knowing how the cell factory is made up of yeast and bacterial cells, consume energy, and how these complicated chemicals are allocated. Okay, well, what's allocated mean? Allocate, to set apart for a particular purpose, to assign or allot, to allocate funds for new projects. Oh, so like if I say, here's the sandwich I'm going to eat at lunch, and I'm going to save this sandwich for dinner. I allocated one of those sandwiches for lunch and one for dinner. Oh, okay. It's like I assigned them a particular role. Okay, I got that. Okay, allocate, to set aside for something. Furthermore, knowing how little cell factories that are made from the cells of bacteria and yeast consume energy and how complicated chemicals are set aside to do so is crucial. You know what? I think I know what crucial means. Isn't that like important or something? Is important when working with industrial fermentations. What's a fermentation? Noun, the act or process of fermenting. Well, that's not very helpful. There are going to be a few words that are more scientific in their nature that you may have to actually go to a biology textbook for. Or, I have to be so careful saying this. You might want to Google search the word, and the first hit might be a Wikipedia article. And while you can't use a Wikipedia article as a source, when you're trying to understand what a word means, it's sometimes actually not a bad idea. All right, so I've gone through the rest of the chunk. I've circled some other vocabulary that I'm unclear of. I've got evoke, to call up or make happen. Metabolism, the total chemical processes of a living thing. Of course, I already looked up fermentation before, and I can reference back to that. Fermentation was something microbes do to make energy. Okay, and respiration. Now, respiration came up with a process for making energy in a living thing using oxygen. So it seems like they're saying now researchers have shown it's possible to make a shift in the chemical processes of a living thing from fermentation to respiration. So like those are two different processes that living things use to make energy. So maybe I need to know more about fermentation. We'll get to that. By optimizing, well, optimize was to make the best use of fermentation, that chemical process, conditions, just the way something is. So let's try that again. Now, researchers have shown it's possible to make a shift in the chemical processes from this one chemical process microbes use to make energy to this other process that they use to make energy using oxygen by making the best use of the conditions where they're using this chemical process to make oxygen. Okay. All right, that doesn't seem so crazy. This shift means cells can be pushed into producing more internal energy, or ATP. Okay, this information can be used to design new and improved cell factories. Corresponding author, professor at Chalmers University, blah, 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 Jens Nielsen says. Okay, well, this starts to sound like something that I can summarize. First, I'm going to look for big ideas in these paragraphs. And I've gone so far as to highlight some of those big ideas. So I'm going to use, and I'm actually using the paintbrush set to very opaque on a pretty wide brush. So knowing how microbes consume energy is important when working with fermentation. Okay. Now, they know that it's possible to shift the metabolism when conditions are good. And cells can be pushed into making more energy. Okay. Now, that's, for each of those chunks, that kind of gets the big piece. For that last little paragraph, which is really only a sentence, what can you do with that information? Well, you can use it to design improved cell factories. What does this mean? The big idea for this whole chunk is if we had to summarize this entire 3 little paragraphs, what would we say? How about somebody figured out how to make cells make more, I'm putting this in quotes, energy chemicals, and that will help us make better industrial processes with cells. Okay, that seems like a reasonable assertion. Now we're going to go to the next couple paragraph chunk. So in the next chunk it says, together with the first author, postdoc Yu Chen from the Department of blah blah blah, studied the metabolism of E. coli and baker's yeast through the use of mathematical models and biological experiments. The research has now been published. We don't really care where. Cells constantly generate high-energy molecules called ATP from sugar, glucose. ATP is the cellular food consumed by the workers, enzymes within the cells. The enzymes use this energy to build biomass or do other cellular work. The more ATP available, the better the microbial workhorses perform in fermentation, at least in principle. Many other aspects play a part. Okay, well, I've circled the words that, might not be familiar. So postdoc, it turns out that's just somebody doing research. Okay, doesn't change the meaning of what I'm reading. Metabolism. I looked that up on the last slide, so I'm just going to make a note from my definition because I pretty much understand that in my own words now. Chemical processes in a living thing. And when you're dealing with a word that's appeared a few times where you're pretty sure you know what it means, you can take a little bit of a shortcut and really abbreviate that definition. Now, enzymes, there's a word you might not have heard. When I looked it up in several sources, what I figured out it means is that these are chemicals produced by living things that help reactions in cells run. Okay. And biomass is just material made by living things. So the grass in your yard is biomass, as are the bodies of bacteria. So what are the big ideas here? Well, here's what I've got. They studied the metabolism of E. coli and baker's yeast, and they think that they can make them make more ATP, which kind of ties in with what we saw in the last slide. So these two studied yeast and bacteria and how they make energy, and think they can make them work harder and better. So what did the last one say? They figured out how to make cells make more energy, which would help them make better industrial processes. Again, they studied the bacteria and the yeast, and they think they can make them work better. All right. We've got one more chunk, maybe two, to go. Okay, I'm on the next chunk, and it says, using a computational approach. Computational, I looked it up, means relating to computers or math calculations. The researchers found out ATP can be generated by either of two pathways. Well, I'm familiar with pathway, like a trail or, maybe an old Jeep trail or something. But I don't think that's what this means. So you're going to need to go to a dictionary. And I want to show you something very specific. I'm using lexico.com, which is another good dictionary to use. Let's see what Lexico's got on pathways. Well, I only screenshotted part of it. The first one was all about trails and, narrow trails across mountains. The second definition, and there were four, a way of achieving a specified result. Number 1.2, the third definition, notice that now they're showing you, this is from physiology. That's a type of biology dealing with how the body functions, a route formed by a chain of nerves along which particular kinds of impulses travel these neural pathways. Well, that doesn't sound like what we're talking about. Because we're talking, remember, about the chemical processes done by cells. Wait a minute. Biochemistry. A sequence of chemical reactions undergone by a compound or a class of compounds inside a living organism. Oh, that sounds like what we want. A sequence of chemical reactions. Okay. So I've made a new little card for myself. Pathway. A series of chemical reactions. Now let's try reading that again. Using a computer-based approach, researchers found out that ATP can be generated by either of two series of chemical reactions. Yeah, that makes sense. A high-yielding respiratory pathway, Well, wait, I just looked up the word respiration. Oh yeah, respiration, where was it? Here it is. Process for making energy in a living thing with O2. So a high-yielding chemical process for making energy, series of chemical reactions. Yeah, okay. So a high-yielding series that results in 23 ATPs, or a low-yielding fermentive pathway. We said, wait, fermentation was just another way that cells make energy. So a low-yielding pathway, a low-yielding series of reactions which only generates 11 ATPs. Huh. So there are two ways to do this, two ways to skin this cat. One gets you 23.5 ATPs, one gets 11 ATPs. The two pathways supplement one another. Supplement, to add to or support. But researchers were able to shift the natural balance between the two by changing the conditions of the fermentation. The chemical process cells use to make energy, and the amount of sugar and protein available. Okay, well, I know what those are. Furthermore, they showed that the high-yielding pathway, is that one, needs more protein mass than the low-yielding pathway. Oh, so the cells need more protein if they're going to make more ATP. They also showed that making some key enzymes, wait, what were enzymes? Oh yeah, the workhorses of the cell. That's right. Enzymes do work in cell. Okay, perform better. They showed making some key enzymes perform better meant the cells changed from doing low-yielding fermentive metabolism to breathing through the high-yielding respiratory mechanism. Whew, okay. Now, I've got some of the big ideas in these three small paragraphs. Number one, there are two pathways, and one gets you a lot more ATP, more than twice as much. The two pathways usually happen at the same time, but if you change the conditions, you can shift the cells over to using the more lucrative pathway, the one that gets you more ATP. And they showed that having some enzymes work better means that they'll do the higher yielding pathway. Let's try to sum that up. Okay, here's my summary. They found there are two ways for cells to generate ATP, and giving the cells more protein and making some enzymes work better gets more of that energy out. Going to our next chunk, we see this. The shift results in more intracellular ATP, but also avoids the buildup of fermentive byproducts, acetate in E. coli, ethanol in baker's yeast. So I know that these are chemicals that are produced in the cells. Intracellular, what does that mean? Inside the cell. It avoids the buildup of fermentive byproducts. I looked it up, and byproducts are something made during a chemical reaction that's not the desired product. So it's like something extra that gets made that you didn't really want. These byproducts are unwanted and decrease the yield of the sought-for molecules you want to produce. Furthermore, the investigators showed that cells performing their best used both pathways. Used both series of chemical reactions, not only the high-yielding one. And more proteins available meant more efficiency, getting the most out of something, in a given pathway. So the solution to better performing cells in fermentation is not to switch off the fermentive pathway, but to allocate, to give to or to assign more protein to the high-yielding pathway. What about a big idea here? Starting to get to the idea that's going to be the idea of the whole article. Cells performing their best used both pathways. More proteins available meant more efficiency in a given pathway. Solution to better performing cells is to allocate more protein to the high-yielding pathway. Let's write a summary. Okay, so what I'm going to say the summary for this chunk is, sending more protein to the high-yielding pathway makes cells perform better and produces less waste or byproduct. Are we done yet? Let's see. So this is our last little paragraph. And if we read this, here's what we're told. The researchers solely exposed the microbes to different fermentation conditions and didn't do genome engineering to evoke these changes. But at the same time, their studies gave an indication of how one can change cells' metabolisms by genome engineering to become more effective in future experiments. Well, I think I need to look up genome engineering. Oh, that would be when they alter the DNA. So they're just saying that they didn't do anything to change their DNA, they just gave them different conditions. But they're saying that their studies would indicate that one could change their metabolism by altering their DNA to be even more effective. Well, okay. Let's look at all of our summaries and try to put them together into one coherent thing. So initially, I'm just going to look at my 4 summaries for my little chunks. Someone figured out how to make cells make more energy chemicals, and that will help us make better industrial processes. These guys, those someones, studied yeast and bacteria and how they make energy and think they can make them work harder and better. They found there are 2 ways for cells to make ATP, and that giving cells more protein and making some enzymes work better gets more energy out. Sending more protein to high-yielding pathway makes cells perform best, produces less waste or byproduct. Is that a pretty good summary of the article? So yeah, these 2 guys did some research and they found that there are actually 2 pathways for cells to make energy, and that they can cause the cell to make more energy if they shift protein to the high-yielding pathway. Wow, I think we got something here. So, in some cases, just putting your 4 or 3 or 5 summaries together will be sufficient. In other words, you'll have to do a little bit of wiggling to get them to sound coherent. But in any case, you're reading something that you might not be able to otherwise. You're building skills. You're mastering stuff. Okay, do you feel like you can use the process of annotation to understand, summarize, and discuss a text? I should hope so. Remember, what you're really doing is having a conversation with the text. We didn't even do any text connections yet, and that's okay. That'll come later, but this should give you a good start on developing a reasonable summary and understanding what the text is saying so that you can talk about it with whoever you need to. Have fun!